Okay, good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. This is our last Cosmic Conversation of our 2022 series. We've had three other conversations that came before this one, and you can check them all out on our YouTube channel or on our website, apph.com.br/cc for Cosmic Conversations. I want to, first of all, to thank Alex Nading and Luisa Hayes Castro to have accepted the invitation to be here with us. As I mentioned, this is our 2022 series, but as Alex has taught us, sometimes things get leaky and they leak over some other places. So we have spilled over here to 2023. But this series of conversations for 2022 is a special collaboration with the Anthropocene curriculum. This project spearheaded by the HKW, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, and also the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, also in Berlin. We at the APPH, the Association for the Research and Practice in the Humanities, have been collaborating with them for almost 3 years now, and we're happy to continue to be a part of this network as it becomes the Anthropocene Commons. You can check more info on that on our social media for the APPH and also our website. And I want to thank Jean, who has very gracefully accepted to be our mediator for this conversation. He has been a friend and a teacher for a long time for me. So I'm also happy that he's here with us. He was an invited speaker a little while ago in one of these Cosmic Conversations in 2020. And now he's mediating here with us, which is great. That's also, it's always our idea to keep everything circulating among us. So without further ado, I will let Jean speak and he will lead this conversation with Alex and Luisa. Thank you.
So thank you, Fernando, and good evening, everyone. So let's start our cosmic conversation today entitled Anthropocene as Disaster and Disease. And first, I like to thank you, Fernando, but not only you, the entire APPH team for promoting this series and so many other exciting activities. And yeah, to be honest, I love I must say, I love the name Cosmic Conversation. So it's a really interesting idea. So yeah, well, as you told you, I'm Rams. I'm a social anthropologist and professor at Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. So today I'm mediate this conversation with these two incredible researchers, Luisa Hayes Castro and Alex Nading. And I accept this invitation, but I'm here because I'm a fan of their work. So thank you again for this opportunity to share this activity. So Luisa and Alex both are anthropologists. Luisa is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California at the Department of Anthropology. She also affiliated with the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life there. And Alex Nading is a medical anthropologist and associate professor at the Cornell, at the Department of Anthropology at Cornell University. So I will only briefly introduce them because my first question concerned their project. So Alex and Luisa, you have worked on mosquitoes, health, ecology, gender, science and technology studies, and multi-species ethnography. So before discussing Anthropocene properly, could you tell us a bit more about your work, or how did you start? Where did you do field work, and what did you have in mind with these issues? Alex, Luisa, feel free. I don't know how Luisa?
I can start this one and then
Okay.
Alex can start the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to also say thank you. Alex, it's an honor to share this conversation with you, but also obrigada, Jean, obrigada, Fernando, Luisa, and everyone else that makes this conversation possible, right? So I'll briefly say that I've always been in between like anthropology and STS, so I started my undergrad in anthropology at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, the UFMG, and then I decided to do a STS master's in the Netherlands, in Maastricht, and that's where I started to think with and about mosquitoes. Because of this master and some collaborations that I was part of, I was able to do field work at a group that was starting to do releases of transgenic mosquitoes. And what kind of attracted me or lured me into mosquitoes was the possibility of thinking with an animal that or an insect that wants so desperately to become with us, right? Or it's especially the Aedes aegypti, it's an anthropogenic kind of insect. So it prefers, or some research shows that some would prefer biting humans, and it needs human blood to mature its eggs. So the kind of their reproduction and their existence is dependent on biting humans. But then this new trend within mosquito science entails using the mosquito to address the very problem that mosquito causes, right? So one of these groups was doing releases in transgenic mosquitoes in the northeast of Brazil. And because I was part of a collaboration, the French group, I was able to do some field work in the city of Juazeiro in Bahia, and to think about what it meant to kind of mass produce the enemy, right? Like what it meant to like care for the enemy or mass produce the very being you're trying to eliminate. And ended up thinking about how this produced something called like non-encounter value, right? So the mosquito kind of embodies the promise of their absence. So while I was doing field work in the Northeast, and it was before I did my PhD, although it wasn't kind of one of my guiding questions as I started my field work, I was also intrigued by kind of the politics of Brazilian science in the releases as well. So all the scientists were from the Southeast and white, and all the workers in the biofactory, the place producing, were local and mostly non-white. So as kind of the science kind of promoted as kind of a Brazilian science effort, I was intrigued about who gets to make these claims about Brazilian science. And as part of my PhD, I still thinking with mosquitoes, or now my book project, right? My book project called The World Will Become Brazil, Ecologies, Epidemics, and the Reinvention of Mosquito Science. So I'm still thinking about mosquitoes, but I'm more interested in how kind of Brazilian mosquito ecologies are kind of envisioned as a harbinger of future mosquito ecologies elsewhere, and therefore future epidemics still to come, right? So I did field work in 3 different places in Brazil, all in projects that were somehow harnessing the mosquito to use the mosquito to address the pathogenic viruses they transmit. So I did field work with a group in Rio, releasing Wolbachia mosquitoes, which are mosquitoes infected with carrying this microbe that hinders viral replication. I did a research with a group in Recife, who are doing irradiated mosquitoes and releasing them in the island of Fernando de Noronha, also in the Northeast. And another group in Foz do Iguaçu using kind of sentinel mosquitoes. So all 3 different projects are kind of using mosquitoes to address the mosquito-borne diseases. But I'm interested in also what kind of claims about mosquito of the possibilities of Brazilian science that they're making, right? So how my interlocutors, my argument is kind of how my interlocutors were aiming not just to transform mosquitoes, right, from a threat into a tool, from a friend into from an enemy into a friend, but also how they were also trying to transform their Brazil and the particular places in which they are in Brazil, right, into a place that can, instead of being beset by epidemics, is also like providing solutions. So there's this kind of double movement, and trying to write a book now about it. So, but yes, I think that's a good overview.
Thank you, Luisa. So Alex, please.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. I echo Lisa's thanks to everybody who organized this. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and especially a pleasure to hear where Luisa's research has gone. I've been following it for years, and it's really exciting to hear about this this incarnation of it, and to think about this book project to be. It's like it's really something. So my story of how I came to this, whatever this is, sort of medical anthropology, which is my field, and its relationship to ecology and environmental and then planetary change. There's a lot of accidents involved. I studied at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and went to start to do field work in a kind of preliminary sense in Nicaragua, in Central America, with very little notion of mosquitoes or infectious disease or public health in mind. I was much more, well, public health, I suppose. I was much more interested in environmental health. I came there to examine the impact of polluted waterways and soils on urban life. I was interested in the one of the two main lakes in the country, Lago Zolofan, Lake Managua, and the impact of pollution there. And sort of because I was connected to some community health workers in the Ministry of Health, found myself one day on a mosquito prevention campaign in a part of the sort of the greater Managua area called Ciudad Sandino. And I was transformed by the experience of seeing how it is that public health workers try to address the presence, the sort of constant everyday presence of Aedes aegypti in people's lives at the most intimate scales, the scales of their houses. And so this prevention method of going house to house and looking for the places where mosquitoes breed sort of became the foundation of the ethnographic field work that I did for my doctoral dissertation that became the book that I wrote called Mosquito Trails. It was very much about that process of how this mosquito that Luisa so nicely described as one that's sort of constantly becoming with us, how that becoming with becomes itself something around which local and maybe even global politics kind of emerge, right? So the epidemic sort of happens through the bodies and the reproductive cycles of people and mosquitoes as they're kind of entangled together. So at least that's kind of the way that I thought about it. And I really got very deep into this investigation of human mosquito relations, and started to pay attention to things like genetic modification of mosquitoes and a lot of the things that Luisa really picked up in her research, probably better than I ever could have done, but kept getting pulled back to some of the things that initially brought me to anthropology and to the study of environmental health, that is toxic chemicals and questions around environmental exposures. And so that's at least in part what my current research is about, which is to do with health and disease in the sugarcane plantation zone of Western Nicaragua. And I got interested in that because it was this moment really during the mosquito field work that I was doing that we started to hear about people who worked in the sugarcane industry being impacted by a strange form of kidney disease, a chronic kidney disease that was a non-diabetic form of kidney disease that had never been seen before. And the workers in that sector strongly believe that it had something to do with toxic chemicals. Others think that it has something to do with rising temperatures and the intensity of that work, which those of you from Brazil will be probably very familiar with. It's started to be something that I'm thinking of as a disease of the Anthropocene or something like that. Although one of the things I've really learned to do is to be very wary of thinking about the Anthropocene or planetary change as a causal mechanism. So that's why I really like this theme that we're talking about today of the as disease part of the theme seems to be really very close to where my thinking is on that. I'm really I think the one thing that I'm kind of always sort of thinking through in my work and in research is sort of what anthropology's place is in all of this. To me, what I think anthropology is particularly equipped to do, or at least what I've been trying to think of it as equipped to do, is to sort of find that seam between the species lines that other people draw. In our case, I mean, in another era, it might have been the lines between cultures or linguistic groups or something like that, and try to live in that seam, because I think that's where a lot of really interesting, at least for me, a lot of really interesting research is happening.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And so to research is too close to Anthropocene discussions, but yeah, sometimes or almost all times when geologists speak of the Anthropocene, they are demarcating a new epoch. Was Earth system transformations has been defined by human action. So, but beyond that, I think in your researches, it's too clear that Anthropocene is more than a geological event. It is also social and political and demands that we jointly analyze ecological catastrophes, extreme events, citizenship, health and social environmental risks. So how have you been working with the Anthropocene in your research, especially considering that you too have a lot of experience across Latin American situations, so in Nicaragua and Brazil. So how can we stress the geological conception, or we can stress the I don't know, so European or so North American European notion about the Anthropocene? So how did the Anthropocene become part of your work, and how you can stress this conception with the anthropology that you practices? Alex, you can.
So yeah, I think it might be my turn to go first.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I was thinking about this. My dissertation advisor, before I even did, I remember that she picked up on the importance of thinking about climate change, planetary change in relationship to mosquitoes really before I did. And she wasn't really an STS or medical anthropology person, but I think that the notion that the intimacy that we see between a species like Aedes aegypti mosquitoes and people is a sort of it's a historical and a natural phenomena, right? And so from the perspective of people in Latin America, the experience of mosquito-borne disease is really tracks along with the experience of drastic landscape and ecological change that goes back really to the moment of, kind of European contact at least, right? And the story of that mosquito is one of my favorites to tell. It's, because its trajectory and its journey across continents and through circuits of trade and travel, some of which have to do with the transatlantic slave trade, some of which have to do with longstanding circuits of economic and social exchange in which white Europeans are not involved at all, right? The mosquito is in some ways in its biology is a history of planetary change. If we think about planetary change in that sense as somehow a historical phenomenon, right? Which I think is one of the things that the Anthropocene is trying to get us to do, to think about people's role in planetary change, geological or not. So that's one of the things that I've that keeps me coming back to this concept, as problematic as it is. I think the other thing is that, in my current research, working on the production of monocrops and the consequences of that, I think there's a lot of really interesting ways in which both the problem of monocrop production and the problem of planetary change kind of intersect with one another. So, some people, know that sort of term Plantationocene as an alternative name for the current epoch, trying to index the ways in which industrialization and simplification have led to certain kinds of catastrophe. That's less important to me than the specific ways in which the promotion of that kind of agriculture has both been a cause of lots of problems, but has also been persistently touted as a potential solution to a lot of those problems, whether it's through solving food security or energy or simple sort of development questions. One reason at least, it seems that development authorities and international lenders and such keep moving us back towards monoculture over and over again, seems to be that it sounds like a way to help people, right? And so there's this way in which development and the logics of development and the logics of sort of ecological sustainability, sometimes they seem at loggerheads, but very often they, there's forces at work that try to line them up, right? And it's almost more violent sometimes, the attempt to make these things work together, than it is to try to artificially pull them apart. And that's one of the things that I've seen in my research. The last thing I'll say on this is just that I'm not 100% sure whether in my little part of the world of medical anthropology, whether Anthropocene matters so much, partly because, important people in health and medicine have brought us this sort of parallel conversation on planetary health, and sort of thinking about health as something that needs to be imagined not only in trans-species lines, but in some ways in kind of Earth system senses. And yet all the stories about planetary health, what makes that concept seem to matter to people are place-based stories. And so I think that actually is a huge opening for anthropology. Not only that anthropology and critical disciplines can critique the ideas behind something like Anthropocene or planetary health and what they contain and what they lack, but also that if those ideas are to mean anything, in some ways, it's up to us to show why people should care about that. And so, and of course, the stories are everywhere. But I think the way that we link up those stories and think about those experiences is really going to be a valuable contribution that we can make. And so we're at this moment now where I think, to me at least, what I'm seeing is that there's a potential realignment in how we think about the thing we've been calling for some time global health. That may not actually be the sort of animating and uniting idea that it once was, and maybe planetary health needs to have a moment or something like that to unite our disciplines and our ideas. I kind of think that if we've learned anything, it's that these ideas and concepts, even if they're rooted in some kind of ontology like the Anthropocene, they really work when they can sort of spark projects and imaginations. And as soon as they don't, as I start to suspect global health is ceasing to do, then really that's fine. I'm less concerned with the labels than the work that gets done around whatever they might be. So.
Can I go? Okay. I will pick on some of the points Alex made, and because the idea of the Anthropocene comes up a little bit in my research, but it comes up a lot more in the collaborative research which I'm doing with two other mosquito scholars, Uli Basil and Tulio da Silva Maia. So we're thinking about this idea as Alex pointed out so well, that within the history of the biology of the mosquito, it has the history of planetary change, right? So we're inspired by kind of the work of Zoe Todd and Heather Davis. They're trying to make this argument that Alex also made, right? That the kind of these changes are starting with colonialism. So perhaps Anthropocene, the date, should also start with the start of colonialism. So what Uli, Tulio, and I are trying to think is having the Anthropocene as beginning with colonialism. Can we think about mosquitoes' presence in Europe as a kind of continuation of the colonial project, right? So we're trying to, our papers called Mosquito Empires Strike Back, thinking about how John McNeill, for those who don't know, wrote this very influential The Mosquito Empires book, which was kind of making the argument that mosquitoes defined the kind of geopolitics of the Greater Caribbean in different ways throughout the centuries. But he doesn't mention that much, but he does mention how like the mosquito could proliferate in these areas because it was the landscapes had been transformed so rapidly, right? So if we have this as a perspective, the presence of mosquitoes in Europe, does that changing the Anthropocene not as something recent and mosquitoes' presence in Europe as the effect of this recent change? What if we think about mosquitoes' presence in Europe as an effect of Europeans colonizing the world, right? Latin America, but also the world. So instead of thinking about kind of and that also one of our efforts in thinking with this is instead of thinking about the South as like a source of threat and invading the walls of Europe, right? Which is unfortunately the current narrative of mosquitoes' presence in Europe, even though they have been there for a long time. We can go more in details like that. Italy had a yellow fever epidemic, right? There's a much longer history there. But even if there is an increase on mosquitoes' presence in Aedes aegypti or Aedes more broadly, not just Aedes aegypti or Aedes albopictus as well, and other species within the Aedes genus. If we have this kind of shift in perspective, then in the South is not the source of a threat, but perhaps the source of the expertise of those who have been living with these mosquitoes for more than a century, right? So can the this shift also kind of, I think Alex also mentioned this, like how can anthropologists kind of help us change the terms of the conversation as well? And I think this project, we're trying to do that. And also briefly, I mean, as I mentioned in my broader my project, I am interested in kind of the claims that Brazilian mosquito ecologies are kind of the future, right? Like my book is kind of inspired by entomologists who told me when it comes to mosquitoes, the world will become Brazil, right? But again, what are the politics of making these claims, and who gets to define that? What does it change about knowledge production? And again, if you're thinking about having a place like Brazil or other like global South countries having like this idea of them being the harbinger of what's going to happen to Europe and the US, or North America and Europe. Again, what are the politics of that? Who gets to define these terms? And still thinking a little bit more about that, but I think that's where the Anthropocene shows up in my research.
Can I just pick up on a couple of things, because I think those ideas are really, really super important to kind of to amplify, right? The one being the kind of looping effects of colonialism of different types. And the other being this notion of a kind of a realignment of where knowledge and expertise reside. And then maybe there's a third, which is a kind of a corollary to that second one, which is the ways in which certain parts of the world, I'm thinking of Jerome Whitington's idea about places become bellwethers, or canaries or whatever, and there's a really, there's a really a lot to unpack there, because in the case of diseases that have been associated, like the ones that I'm studying now, with extreme heat, there's both a recognition that landscapes like the Pacific coast of Nicaragua are somehow the front lines, right, of a new set of problems, and also an incredible amnesia around that. So in a lot of ways, Nicaraguan sugarcane farms have become laboratories for understanding heat-related diseases, thanks to the advocacy and activism of people who were affected by those diseases. And of course, thanks also to this planetary health concern that's emergent. But what's never there's a lot of problems with that kind of research. But one of the things that is really striking to me is that most people in Nicaragua can tell you the environmental history of that place, and they would talk about it in terms of drastic changes that really precede by decades and sometimes centuries the actual onset of disease. That is, deforestation, loss of water resources, loss of traditional indigenous land practices, right? All of this sort of theft and exploitation and destruction that almost gets normalized when everything gets temporalized as the now, right? So that's just to echo what Lisa was saying, is that like work like what she's doing on the empire striking back in mosquitoes in Europe, right, is really critical, because it helps us tell these stories and remind people who are doing really important critical work and understanding what's going on, that their work is enabled in some ways by these longer histories, right, of damage and harm. And I think that helps unsettle the notion that there's sort of these leading edges or bellwether places that are going to give us lessons, right? Because that's sort of the last insult that we're now going to draw lessons from the damage that we've created.
Oh, yeah, so fantastic. And when I heard you now, and I remember, I don't know, we have together in Florianopolis a couple years ago, and I remember when Alex addressed something about your work with sugarcane workers in Nicaragua, and I remember a guy putting some ask from attending the talk, and they asked something about the relation between climate change and disease. I remember you answered the climate change is the disease. So this is the point. So my question now, it's a bit related this, because yeah, we are talking about Anthropocene, but Anthropocene as disaster is a bit more common, but with as a disease. So what does it mean consider Anthropocene as a disease? How does consequence to think this, or to put this question in on the table? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, Luis or Alex.
I can start, although maybe Alex have the answer. I don't know if I have the answer for that one. But again, we're kind of using as a synonym, but it's not like the Anthropocene and planetary health, right? I think those, as Alex mentioned, kind of more.
Gene, are you there? Because I'm.
Yeah, yes, I'm here, but I don't know, Luis stopped for me.
Maybe she might have lost her connection. I can try to pick it up maybe for a moment while she's coming back online.
Yes.
Thank you for remembering that. It seems like a long time ago that we were in Florianópolis, and I remember those conversations really fondly. And that was, interestingly, that's one of the threads that's remained in the work that I've been doing, and it's still a theme of the book that I'm working on, which is that I do think that it's valuable to make the argument that climate change and these kinds of diseases are the same thing, and one of the ways in which I come to that is that if we think about climate change as and I think this is Elizabeth de Lowry, where I got this idea, as a rupture to an ecological system, right? And many of us who do sort of political ecology of health, or medical history, or medical anthropology, or even social epidemiology, well before we started talking seriously and constantly about climate change, I think we were sort of on board with the idea of the body as a kind of ecological system, right? Warwick Anderson sort of mined the history of where that idea comes from, and other people, but like there's this acceptance of that, right? That the body is nature, right? And it's not nature just because it's a biological organism, but because it's enveloped and entangled with its surrounds, right? So dysbiosis of different kinds, whether it's microbiota, whether it's an immune response to a viral infection, or whether it's the deterioration of kidney function, to me, at a certain level, does become climate change, right? And that's not to dehumanize the human, but it's to recognize that, as critical medical anthropologists have long done, that there's nothing natural about modern plagues, right? The persistence of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa for years after viable therapies were available was a man-made disaster, right? But it fundamentally had to do with a change in the environment of sub-Saharan Africa, which fundamentally had to do with what we were just talking about a few moments ago, which was climate, right? So you can look at work by people like Abby Neely or Brian King, geographers that have looked at this, and or even Paul Farmer, right? The late Paul Farmer, and what you see is that environmental change, what we might now think of as the roots of climate change, are connected to diseases in this sort of way. So it's not even to say that the Anthropocene is a disease, to me, is not just to find the ones that seem to be like the climate diseases, right? Which, the kidney ailment that I'm most interested in might be thought of that way. That's one way to do it, right? But I think a different way to do it would be to look at the ways in which all kinds of new and pre-existing conditions are signs of a planetary or an ecological dysbiosis, right? And I think the thing that might make it different, right, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that notion of an irreversibility, right? That at some point things can't go back to the way they were, right? That either some drastic change has to be made to social organization or economic organization or technology to deal with it, or it will become a part of life, right? And that's sort of the thing that is the most important and yet the hardest to embrace and address part of this idea of the Anthropocene. So now that I have said my piece, I can pass it back to Louisa and let her continue with her.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm out of, there's no internet in my house, so I'm joining through the phone, but you can hear me okay, right? So unfortunately, I didn't hear everything you said, but the last words, I very much agree. I think I wanted to just also mention one of the things thinking about the planetary change, or thinking about these planetary changes, and you call it this idea that you can't go back, we can't go back, right? One of the things that, so here at USC, we're starting to kind of form a group to think about these planetary changes, planetary health, with Andy Lakoff and Peter Redfield, who are also interested in these questions. But one of the things we're thinking is, what does it mean for this change to think about the planetary, and so for example, we have the work from Cueto and Fee and Brown, right? I think, who were thinking about what does it mean to change from international health to global health? So what does it mean also to think about this change from global health and to planetary health, right? Like to think about the planet. And I think, maybe you also said this, Alex, sorry, but one of the things I think is, as you mentioned, there is, within the concerns with planetary change, there is this awareness of the importance of the place. And while in global health, there was an awareness that the local shapes the global, right? It was very much what kind of global health, like an epidemic in one place can become an epidemic, an outbreak in one place can become an epidemic everywhere. But I think with the planetary change, there's also a concern over the very livability of that place, right? It's not just about how the local and the global connect, but if the local is livable, right? Like, so I think there is that change, and I think thinking about the planetary or the Anthropocene can also help us think more about that.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. That this notion of uninhabitability or unlivability is now a real prospect, and, which of course raises questions about what how that idea is defined and who defines it. I mean, there's an absolute limit to livability, right? In terms of the organism's capacity to withstand something like a sustained 120 degree temperature kind of situation. But I think what's really interesting is the gradations of livability, and where actually maybe the politics of planetary health might be. And I'm really just thinking of this now. This is really helpful to hear this from you, Louisa, because I've been working on a project about imagining what livability might be through scenario building. So using ethnography to talk to people about what they imagine their home might look like in 20 years, and what's the best case scenario, and what's the worst case scenario, and what are some scenarios in between, and trying to think about those not as just predictions in the way that pandemic predictions that, like what Andy Lakoff has written about, worked, but as tools for thinking about that very concept of livability. This is something that Claire Wendland, the medical anthropologist, brought me into this project about a year ago, and we've been trying to develop it in this way. And one reason I got interested in this when Claire brought this idea of thinking about developing scenarios from distinct locations and seeing what they had in common was that it occurred to me that in the cases that I've been looking at, that's precisely what's at stake, right? And in some ways always has been at stake. But if, say, workers in the construction industry or in the sugarcane industry or in the California fruit industry are exposed to extremes of temperature, are exposed to new kinds of toxicants, the industrial health question has always been, how much can they be exposed and still keep going to work, right? Which is really, it's workability, but it does, but it presumes that that's the equal to livability, right? And so I think what I'm trying to get at is that I think one of the other things that anthropology offers are these lessons about how livability is imagined in place, and how that might not actually be the same imaginary as the imaginary of the biomedical or the population health intervention that's trying to fix discrete problems. So in other words, I said earlier that global health was kind of maybe going to be descending in importance and as an animating concept, but one of the things that seems to still stick, especially in the corridors of medical research and funding, is this idea of reducing things to particular problems that can be solved, right? So the political problem seems to be when livability is equated only with the reduction of a particular kind of threat, rather than something broader. So there's a politics of livability that's happening in different ways and in different places. And I think it would be really interesting to think about your project as, how do you sew together these different notions of livability, and what kinds of and what kinds of things are overlapping, and where are the tensions, and what sort of livability imaginary, what kind of dream of livability travels, and what kind is sort of earthbound in different ways.
That's great. Thank you. Just wanted to say.
Yes. So really good point. So yeah, and I don't know, but especially thinking in the guys attending this conversation, and in your works, on your previous work, especially we working on mosquitoes. This is a vector of a lot of diseases, Zika and chikungunya, yellow fever, and dengue, especially dengue. So almost all the time, this kind of issues relating health and animals is close, or I don't know how to say. Sometimes people analyze in separate cases, animal health and human health and environmental health. And I think in you both work, you're talking about human health, human-animal health relations, or sometimes in a multi-species health idea. So this is a really interesting point. And we have some projects such as One Health, for example, but sometimes One Health it's I don't know, One Health is a project that think health solutions involving humans, animals, and environment. But this is a project with a lot of problems, and many problems, mainly because, sometimes the One Health echoes the same problems of global health, because it's a bit, I don't know, which could be better consider the local sensitivities, but it's only a global project, a vertical project on local sensibility. So, and yeah, think about these issues. My last questions is a bit related with the previous one. Yeah, before talking about One Health, can we talk about one disease in the same sense? One disease that affect humans, animals, and environments, and would the Anthropocene this one disease? So this is a first step of the question, and especially thinking in Brazilian case, we have these issues in two separate cases. Many people are working on Anthropocene in philosophy, sociology, arts, and yeah, and especially in environmental studies. Yes, and a lot of people working in health, but not crossing these issues. So how can we bring the Anthropocene to the center of the medical anthropology? So this is to think about this.
I don't think I have a particular answer for a way to bring it to the center of medical anthropology, because I think there's a beauty to anthropology's, you know, and a maddening frustration to anthropology's sort of refusal of having like, or suspicion of dominant centers. I mean, there obviously always are some. But I guess I want to start off by thinking about this idea of a one disease. And I think it's provocative. I think the danger in both One Health and One Disease is, to me, the oneness, the normativity of it. And it seems to imply that there either is a steady state health that might be gone back to, which is where I think like One Health is sort of like born just slightly ahead of, it's sort of an older cousin of planetary health, you know, but it sort of relies on managing dynamic equilibriums, mostly in industrial or semi-industrial agricultural systems, or for a semi-industrial agricultural systems. And, you know, kind of trying to borrow some of those biosecurity logics, you know, that are sort of exported from agriculture into global health back into agriculture, right? Or something like that, right? And I think that's where anthropologists sort of saw like, oh, this is maybe kind of old wine in new bottles, right? And another problem with One Health, of course, is that it sort of imagines that, you know, ultimately the health is probably still human health, you know, however that's defined, whether it's the security of the food system or freedom from exposure to disease, and often infectious disease. So I kind of wonder about One Health. I mean, I work near, you know, we have a veterinary school here at Cornell, and they're very interested in One Health. But I suspect One Health is what they've always been doing, right? Which is trying to help industrial farmers keep birds and livestock healthy, so that and trying to manage the crossover between species in different sorts of ways. That's my suspicion. I mean, I don't know. I guess I find One Health to be in some ways quite a disappointing space when you get close to it. But with One Disease, I think there's some equally potentially fraught territory there. And what I would say is that I've found a lot of wisdom from critical disability studies on this. Eli Clare has that wonderful book on that now I'm going to forget the name of because I'm trying to think of it, but it's their book on kind of nature, and it's a series of essays around the body and nature, and one of the things, Grappling with Cure is at least part of the title. But one of the things that Claire is trying to say is that these notions of a normative health and these notions of a normative nature are similarly flawed, and that they imagine that those who could never get there are always already less than or somehow not equipped to live, right? So in other words, livability is always for some in some kinds of bodies and some kinds of nature. And I think the argument that they're making there is that once we're in this point where there is no return to a prior state, or maybe as in the case of places where, like many parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, where things like plantation agriculture have been dominant for so long, the past isn't that great anyway, right? Maybe we should refuse that idea that there's one disease and that what we should be looking for is a repair, right? And think about a different kind of durational living. So that's sort of my response to that provocation.
I can add a few words because kind of I agree with everything Alex said, but also as an ethnographer, I'm always intrigued why do they think One Health, for example, your colleagues in Cornell, why do they think One Health works for them, right? Like, so trying to think why now there's this boom on planetary health, right? Like what do our interlocutors also think that these words, new words, are doing for them, and what are they mobilized? So planetary health, for example, is one that kind of so many people have very different understanding of what is actually being discussed when they talk about planetary health, right? And it is one of the to just go back to the discussion about the Anthropocene is although I know a lot of people have criticized, and we have 100 other forms of scene, I like the discussion of keeping on, or what I like about Anthropocene is that if I talk to my colleagues who are in the natural science, they get it, what it is. They might have a very different definition, and they will not think it started when colonialism started, but it's also kind of a boundary object in the sense that you can kind of communicate with others that you might have a hard time if you're talking about the Capitalocene in particular, right? Like other forms of scene. So I think that there is this power yet on the Anthropocene as a conversation starter with people in other disciplines beyond the humanities, social science, and the arts. And I would just also add your last question, Tia, about how can we bring I don't remember Anthropocene to medical anthro. I think that was your question or something along those lines. And I think unfortunately it wasn't a topic in our conversation, but I think unfortunately COVID also changed that in terms of these conversations. Someone who was in the job market, I had to present my research, right? I had to make a claim why it mattered. And before COVID, I had to spend a long time why anthropologists should be interested in this kind of relations between health science and the environment. And I think after COVID, and in a very unfortunate way, I wish my work wasn't as relevant, right? But I think it did change the terms of conversation. And I think thinking about health and the environment after COVID started, it did change what kind of questions are being asked, why, and kind of the terms of the conversation. So
yeah. So yeah, our time is finished, but we have one or two questions from the YouTube chat. I don't know if Luisa Mutillo. Luisa Mutillo is engaged with us. Luisa Mutillo is a part of the team of the APPH. I don't know if Luisa wants to put the question, or can I read from the chat, Luisa? I don't know. Luisa.
Hi.
Yeah, Luisa put some questions.
Yeah, I can make it. I can read it. I think that it connects with what Luisa was saying right now, actually, because I think that I would like to know how the people who live in these places that your research, where the disease have existed for a long time, as Alex mentioned. What do they think about the idea that now we are entering a hotspot? Now is the moment to look at this, like how like it was a new disease, or the moment to look at it. Does this make sense to those who live with these animals and the disease for a long, long time?
I'm not, can you clarify? Are you talking about the mosquitoes in Brazil? I wasn't sure, or maybe I missed some of the part that Alex was talking. Is it about like thinking the idea of lesson learned that Alex was mentioning? Is that where the question is going? Or Alex, I mean, I can say a little bit about the case of this idea that Brazil will become kind of the harbinger of what other places will endure when it comes to mosquito-borne diseases, right? And this kind of narrative in the US of that the mosquitoes are coming for us, and implied on us is people who haven't been living with mosquito-borne, like the idea that mosquito-borne diseases is a growing issue is only for the people who haven't been living with mosquitoes for so long, right? So there's this kind of like implicit or very explicit actually framing of who matters in these cases. And I think that the point that Alex mentioned of this idea that these places suffered and now they're like a source for lessons learned that other people can benefit. What is a bit different in my project is it's Brazilian scientists who are doing these projects, right? So, and they have like the argument that they not only mosquito ecologies in Brazil are ideal to test these strategies, they also have the expertise. So they are making claims about having long-established departments and universities and foundations that have been dealing with mosquito-borne diseases. Again, as part of my project, it's also still usually a white Brazilian elite, right? So there is like these different hierarchies that we have to think, but they are making claims that they have been dealing with this as several historians of science and health have shown us, right? Like Brazilian science is very much connected to addressing mosquito-borne diseases, and especially addressing the ones transmitted by the Aedes aegypti. So I think that answered the question. Yeah, okay, great.
Maybe I can just speak to it briefly. I mean, this situation's different in different places, and certainly Nicaragua is not, it doesn't have that deep history of primary research, and in fact, in many ways, the potentials for that have been, have been suppressed not only by successive governments but also by corporations that, in the case of occupational health, seem disinterested in local Nicaraguan knowledge proliferating too much, let's say that. But I think the ways in which people sort of get a sense of themselves as being part of a hotspot is a really interesting one. I mean, I think there is a value to people having that sensibility. And I think one of the things that maybe is a carryover, not really a carryover, but something that remains, whether or not we talk about planetary health or Anthropocene health or global health, is the capacity for people to use their stories and their experiences to create solidarities and call attention to what they would like livability to look like. And so, I mean, one of the things that that I've been thinking about is the way that a lot of the important lessons we might learn from for health in the time of the Anthropocene, still will come from the margins, and not because they are our future, right? But because the margins are so fragmented that maybe what they'll make us realize is that not only do we not know what our future is going to look like, but this idea of a unified future or a unified teleology is the thing that we may have to give up on. When we start to like listen to the stories from planetary and economic and political margins, as anthropologists have always done. So that's maybe another kind of thing to come out of this, right? Is that there's not it's not just looking ahead at what we might become, but at multiple kinds of becomings that are happening in ways that can't be predicted, because there is, one of the consequences of this epoch is certainly not only that the past isn't going to return, but that the future is not going to be in any way a kind of unified, sort of predictable sort of thing.
Yes, Bernardo Livgoy, our colleague here, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, put some comments on chat, and sum up in this. Bernardo is saying something about a lot of the presence of the vectors as mosquitoes, but sandflies and others, but not only considering the chemicals, the agribusiness activities, the illegal mining, and a lot of problems we are living now. So he finished the comment. So the Anthropocene is a really kind of anthropogenic disease. So this is the point of I think this conversation. So now I invite you to give us some last comments about this topic, because we need to finish. But yeah, this is the point. Is the Anthropocene an anthropogenic disease?
I suppose I would accept that. I think with the caveat again that some of the relevant work's already been mentioned, but that we need to be very careful about the what we are nostalgic for, even though we know about the damage of industrial toxicity and about the spread of new infections and that sort of thing. What we might be nostalgic for, and what we might be maybe fooling ourselves into thinking that we're working our way back towards. I think if you look at the outcomes of the pandemic response in different places, right, not only was it obviously hugely unjust, but the history is already being written in such a way that there's this illusion of a return to something that didn't exist before, but in some ways it's becoming, the narrative is becoming more cemented that it did in this idea of a recovery and a return. So I think the real intellectual and political challenge is to think about futures that don't look like past, or that don't even rely on some of the same sorts of models and norms, because that seems to be what the moment is asking us to try and do.
I can say a few words, just thinking about the Anthropocene. As Alex was saying, I was just thinking that one of the things I often highlight when we think about the Anthropocene, we think about like it's a negative thing for everyone or for everything. And as for the Aedes aegypti, it has been kind of beneficial, right? Like the mosquito has been proliferating because of the transformations, as I mentioned, right? Like it's in Europe now because of the transformations that have been caused by anthropogenic action. So to think about what are these transformations that we are causing and who's benefiting, like the idea of like who's benefiting and who's not, who, as Alex mentioned, right, like what kind of futures are being imagined into different interventions that are being proposed to address these harms or effects, or however we want to call, I think as anthropologists, we have a crucial capacity or task to really ask these questions and add nuance to kind of like this tendency to become like the planetary, the kind of universalizing and kind of unified. So how can we as anthropologists kind of ask questions or probe or kind of pick on threads that kind of problematize the kind of lack of nuance that sometimes these projects to address the Anthropocene kind of propose.
So yes, well, we need to finish our conversation, but I must thank you because it's a really exciting discussion you given us. So thank you for your participation. Thank you, Fernando and Luisa, for chairing this activity. And so thank you to everyone for just attending the conversation. So I will waiting for the next one because this is a so amazing series. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you again, and thank you for everyone who's watching on YouTube as well. Obrigada.
Yes, thank you. It was a pleasure.
So just a few last words. I wanted to thank Alex and Luisa for accepting our invitation, and Jeff for the mediation, and all of you that have been watching us on YouTube. And just to remember, this is our last conversation of 2022 series, and it will be available here in YouTube channel, and you can find all of them, including our previous series of the past 2 years in the website of the association, apph.com. And soon we will have another series of conversation this year, so stay tuned and go check it. So that's it. Thank you very much. It was an amazing conversation.